Okay, hello. I'm starting this a bit late, so I might split the chapter into three parts if my brother comes home with dinner in the middle of it, but I don't know if he will. Um, but yeah, 834. Chapter 834. I mean, chapter 35. Not chapter 834. Chapter 35 on page 834. There's a cool picture of Nixon I like, because he's younger in that photo. It's interesting, I'd never seen him when he was younger. He has a rugged charm about him. Let's see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I gotta see. 11. There's like 11 pages to the end. I really have to see Sunday. This It didn't. It went away. Yeah. Okay. Okay. The military seesaw in Korea. Let me get right to it. Rather than fight his way out of the southern Pusan perimeter, I just said Pusan. What the fuck? Pusan perimeter. MacArthur launched a daring amphibious landing behind the enemy's lines. I can't pronounce these. Okay, bear with me. At Incheon, this bold gamble on September 15, 1950 succeeded brilliantly. Within 2 weeks, the North Koreans had scrambled back behind the sanctuary of the 38th parallel. Truman's avowed intention was to restore South Korea to its former borders, but the pursuing South Koreans had already crossed the 38th parallel, and there seemed little point in permitting the North Koreans to regroup and come again. The UN General Assembly tactically authorized by a crossing by MacArthur, whom President Truman ordered northward, provided that there was no armed intervention by the Chinese or Soviets. The Americans thus raised the stakes in Korea, and in so doing, quickened the fears of another potential player in this dangerous game. The Chinese had publicly warned that they would not sit idly by and watch hostile troops approach the strategic Yalu River boundary beyond Korea and China. But MacArthur pooh-poohed all predictions of an effective intervention by the Chinese and reportedly boasted that he would have the boys home by Christmas. MacArthur erred badly. In November 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese volunteers fell upon his rashly overextended lines and hurled the UN forces reeling back down the peninsula. The fighting now sank to a frostbitten stalemate on the icy terrain near the 38th parallel. An imperious MacArthur, humiliated by this rout, pressed for drastic retaliation. He favored a blockade of the Chinese coast and bombardment of Chinese bases in Manchuria. He even suggested that the United States use nuclear weapons on the invading Chinese in their supply lines. But Washington policymakers, with anxious eyes on Moscow, refused to enlarge the already costly conflict. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff declared that a wider class in Asia would be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. Europe, not Asia, was the administration's first concern, and the USSR, not China, loomed as the more sinister foe. Truth is that General MacArthur felt that he was being asked to fight with one hand tied behind his back. He sneered at the concept of a limited war and insisted that there is no substitute for victory. Truman bravely resisted calls for nuclear escalation. When MacArthur began to criticize the president's policies publicly, Truman had no choice but to remove the insubordinate general from command, which he did on April 11, 1951. In July, truce discussions began in a root field tent near the firing line, but were almost immediately snagged on the issue of prisoner exchange. Talks dragged on unproductively for nearly 2 years while men continued to die. Meanwhile, MacArthur, a legend in his own mind, returned to an uproarious American welcome, whereas in many circles, Truman was condemned as a pig, an imbecile, and a Judas, and an appeaser of communism. This domestic response to the Truman-MacArthur conflict offered just a hint of depth of the popular passions coursing through the Cold War at home. The Cold War home front. As never before, international events deeply shaped American political and economic developments at home in the years after World War II. The solidifying Cold War with Russia fueled domestic political conflict and drew new boundaries for acceptable political opinion. Meanwhile, the post-war economic order that the United States helped to forge, combined with Cold War spending and investment, laid the foundations for a long boom that transformed the country over the next several decades. A new anti-red chase accelerated within America's borders as U.S.-Soviet relations froze. Many nervous citizens feared that communist spies, paid with Moscow gold, were undermining the government and treacherously misdirecting foreign policy. In 1947, Truman launched a massive loyalty program. The Attorney General drew up a list of 90 supposed disloyal organizations, none of which was given the opportunity to prove its innocence. The Loyalty Review Board investigated more than 3 million federal employees, some 3,000 of whom either resigned or were dismissed, none under formal indictment. Individual states likewise became intensely security conscious. Loyalty oaths in increasing numbers were demanded of employees, especially teachers. The gnawing question for many earnest Americans was, could the nation continue to enjoy traditional freedoms, especially freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and the right to a political dissent in a Cold War climate? In 1949, 11 communists were brought before the New York jury for violating the Smith Act of 1940, the first peacetime anti-sedition law since 1798. Convicted of advocating the overthrow of the American government by force, the defendants were sent to prison. The Supreme Court upheld their convictions in Dennis v. the United States, 1951. Sip. My braces are stabbing into my cheek. The House of Representatives in 1938 had established the House of Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, to investigate subversion. In 1948, committee member Richard M. Nixon, an ambitious red catcher, led the chase after Alger Hiss, a prominent ex-New Dealer and a distinguished member of the Eastern establishment. Accused of being a communist agent in the 1930s, Hiss demanded the right to defend himself. He dramatically met his chief accuser before HUAC in August 1948. Hiss denied everything but was caught in embarrassing falsehoods, convicted of perjury in 1950, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The stunning success of Soviet scientists in developing an atomic bomb was attributed by many to the clever communist spies who stole American secrets. Notorious among those who had allegedly leaked atomic data to Moscow were 2 American citizens, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were convicted in 1951 of espionage and sent to the electric chair in 1953, the only people in American history ever executed in peacetime for espionage. The declassified evidence has subsequently strengthened the case against the Rosenbergs. At the time, they enjoyed the support of many Americans who believed their claims of innocence. Their sensational trial and electrocution, combined with sympathy for their 2 orphan children, began to sour some sober citizens on the excess of the Red Hunters. Was America really riddled with Soviet spies? Soviet agents did infiltrate certain government agencies, though without severely damaging consequences, and espionage may have helped the Soviets develop an atomic bomb somewhat sooner than they would have otherwise. Truman's loyalty program thus had a basis in reality. But for many ordinary Americans, the hunt for communists was not just about fending off the military threat of the Soviet Union. Unsettling dangers lurked closer to home. While men like Nixon and Senator Joseph McCarthy lit the search for communists in Washington, conservative politicians at the state and local levels discovered that all manner of social changes, including declining religious sentiment, increased sexual freedom, and agitation for civil rights, could conveniently be tarred with a red brush. Anti-communist crusaders ransacked school libraries for subversive textbooks and drove debtors, drinkers, and homosexuals, all alleged to be security risks, from their jobs. Some Americans, including President Truman, realized that the Red Hunt was turning into a witch hunt. In 1950, Truman vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Bill, which, among other provisions, authorized the president to arrest and detain suspicious people during an internal security emergency. Critics protested that the bill smacked of police state, concentration camp tactics, but the congressional guardians of the Republic's liberties enacted the bill over Truman's veto. The demagogic policies of anti-communism found its most dangerous practitioner in Joseph R. McCarthy, an obstreperous Republican senator from Wisconsin, elected to the Senate on the basis of a trumped-up war hero record. The swaggering senator crashed into the limelight in February 1950 when he accused Secretary of State Dean Acheson of knowingly employing 205 Communist Party members. Pressed to reveal the names, McCarthy later conceded that there were only 57 genuine communists, and in the end failed to identify even one. Some of McCarthy's Republican colleagues nevertheless realized the partisan usefulness of this kind of attack on the Democratic administration. Ohio Senator John Bricker reportedly said, "Joe, you're a dirty SOB, but there are times when you've got to have an SOB around, and this is one of them." McCarthy's rhetoric grew bolder, and his accusations spread more widely over the next several years. He saw the red hand of Moscow everywhere. The Democrats, he charged, bent to whispered pleas from the lips of traitors. Incredibly, he even announced General George Marshall, former Army Chief of Staff and ex-Secretary of State, as a part of conspiracy so immense and infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. McCarthy and what became known as McCarthyism flourished in the seething Cold War atmosphere of suspicion and fear. The senator was neither the first nor the most effective Red Hunter, but he was surely the most ruthless, and he did the most damage to the American traditions of fair play and free speech. The careers of countless officials, writers, and actors were ruined after Low Blow Joe had named them, often unfairly, as communists or communist sympathizers. Politicians trembled in the face of such onslaughts, especially when opinion polls showed that a majority of the American people approved of McCarthy's crusade. At the peak of his powers, McCarthy effectively controlled personnel policy at the State Department. One baleful result was severe damage to morale and effectiveness of the professional foreign service. In particular, McCarthy purges deprived the government of a number of Asian specialists who might have counseled a wiser course in Vietnam in the fateful decade that followed. McCarthy's antics also damaged America's international reputation for fair and open democracy at a moment when it was important to keep Western Europe on the United States' side. McCarthy finally bent the bow too far when he attacked the U.S. Army, or bent the bow, when he attacked the U.S. Army. The embattled military men fought back in 35 days of televised hearings in the spring of 1954. Up to 20 million Americans at a time watched the Army-McCarthy hearings in fascination while Boris Shirley McCarthy publicly cut his own throat by parading his essential meanness and irresponsibility. A few months later, the Senate formally condemned him for conduct unbecoming a member. 3 years later, unwept and unsung, McCarthy died of chronic alcoholism. But McCarthyism has passed into the English language as a label for the dangerous forces of unfairness and fear that a democratic society can unleash at its peril. Beyond fights over security and civil liberties, the Cold War shaped American culture in complex and profound ways. Many Americans interpreted this conflict between the capitalist West and the communist and officially secular East in religious terms. Truman found the support for casting the Cold War as a battle between good and evil from theologians like influential liberal protest clergyman Reinhold Niebuhr. A vocal enemy of fascism, communism, and pacifism in the 1940s and 50s, Niebuhr divided the world into two polarized camps, the children of light and the children of darkness. For Niebuhr, Christian justice, including force if necessary, required a realist response to children of darkness, like Hitler and Stalin. But Niebuhr's realism also emphasized the dangers of fallibility and the limits of power, in contrast to the more crusading spirit of conservative Christian anti-communists. The post-war decade saw an emphasis on religious belief of any kind as a distinguishing feature of the American way, to be defended against atheistic communism. Congress's decision to insert the words "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 epitomized this Cold War impulse. The Cold War influenced domestic politics and society in still other ways. Radical voices in institutions ranging from unions and universities to churches and civic organizations were muzzled. Advocates for racial justice in the United States among those voices were some of the most forceful advocates for racial justice in the United States. Even moderate agitators for civil rights were often slandered as communists and fellow travelers. But at the same time, competition with the Soviets for international support, like the earlier Allied fight against fascism during World War II, placed pressure on the United States to live up to its own stated democratic ideals. This created new political opportunities and rhetorical tools for advocates to press civil rights claims. An early example of the new international politics of civil rights came in 1948 when President Truman issued his landmark Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. Sorry. Chewed some ice, taking a sip. The wire in my mouth is going to kill me. I'm convinced of it. Post-war economic anxieties. The communist menace was not the only specter haunting Americans after World War II. Economic uncertainty also loomed over the new peace. The decade of the 1930s had left deep scars. Joblessness and insecurity had pushed up the suicide rate and dampened the marriage rate. Babies went unborn as pinched budgets and sagging self-esteem wrought sexual depression in American bedrooms. The war had banished the blight of depression, but would the respite last? Grim-faced observers were warning that the war had only temporarily lifted the pall of economic stagnation, and that the peace would bring the return of hard times. Homeward-bound GIs, so the gloomy predictions ran, would step out of the Army's chow lines and back into the bread lines of the unemployed. The faltering economy in the initial post-war years threatened to confirm the worst predictions of the doomsayers who foresaw another Great Depression. Real gross national product, GNP, slumped sickeningly in 1946 and 1947 from its wartime peak. With the removal of wartime press controls, prices levitated by 33% in 1946 to 47. An epidemic of strikes swept the country. During 1946 alone, some 4.6 million laborers laid down their tools, fearful that soon they could barely afford the autos and other consumer goods their war-commandeered factories would soon manufacture. The growing muscle of organized labor deeply annoyed many conservatives. They had their revenge against labor's New Deal gains in 1947 when a Republican-controlled Congress, the first in 14 years, passed the Taft-Hartley Act over President Truman's vigorous veto. Labor leaders contend the Taft-Hartley Act as a slave labor law. It outlawed the closed, all-union shop, made unions liable for damages that resulted from jurisdictional disputes among themselves, and required union leaders to take a non-communist oath. Taft-Hartley was one of the several obstacles that slowed the growth of organized labor in the years after World War II. In the heady days of the New Deal, unions had spread swiftly in the North, especially in the huge manufacturing industries like steel and automobiles. But labor's post-war efforts to organize in the historically anti-union regions of the South and West proved frustrating. The CIO's Operation Dixie, aimed at unionizing Southern textile workers and steel workers, failed miserably in 1948 to overcome white workers' lingering fears of racial mixing. Anti-communist purges removed from laborers' ranks some of its most active organizers, and most importantly, workers in the rapidly growing service sector of the economy proved much more difficult to organize than the thousands of assembly line workers who in the 1930s had poured into the auto and steel unions. Organized labor played a significant role in shaping the economic and political order in the United States for several decades after World War II, but the number of organized private sector workers would peak in the 1950s and then begin a long, slow decline that had yet to reverse over a half-century later. The Democratic administration, meanwhile, took some steps to forestall an economic downturn. It sold war factories and other government installations to private businesses at fire sale prices. It secured passage of the Employment Act of 1946, made it government policy to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. The act created a 3-member council of economic advisors to provide the president with the data and the recommendations to make that policy a reality. Most dramatic was the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights, or the GI Bill. Enacted partly out of fear that the employment markets would never be able to absorb 15 million returning veterans at war's end, the GI Bill tided ex-soldiers over as members of the 52-20 Club. $20 a $20 a week for up to 52 weeks, and made generous provisions for sending the former soldiers to school. In the post-war decade, some 8 million veterans advanced their education at Uncle Sam's expense. The majority attended technical and vocational schools, but colleges and universities were crowded to the blackboards as more than 2 million ex-GIs stormed the halls of higher learning. The total eventually spent for education was some $14.5 billion in taxpayer dollars, $2 billion more than the Marshall Plan. The act also enabled the Veterans Administration, VA, to guarantee about $16 billion in loans for veterans to buy homes, farms, and small businesses. By raising educational levels and stimulating the construction industry, the GI Bill powerfully nurtured the robust and long-lived economic expansion that eventually took hold in the late 1940s and profoundly shaped the post-war era. Excuse me. Democratic divisions in 1948. Excuse me. I got sorry, there was spit all in my mouth and I had to get it out of there. Disgusting. Sorry, Democratic divisions in 1948. Attacking high prices and high-tax Harry Truman, the Republicans had won control of Congress in the congressional elections of 1946. Their prospects had seldom looked rosier as they gathered in Philadelphia to choose either their 1948 presidential candidates. They noisily renominated warmed-over New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, still as debonair as if he had stepped out of a bandbox. What? Also gathering in Philadelphia, Democratic politicos looked without enthusiasm to their hand-me-down president and sang, "I'm just mild about Harry." But a dumped Truman movement collapsed when war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to be drafted. The peppery president, unwanted but undaunted, was then chosen in the face of vehement opposition by Southern delegates, alienated by his strong stand in favor of civil rights for blacks, especially his desegregation of the military. Truman's nomination split the party wide open. Embittered Southern Democrats from 13 states, like their fire-eating forebears of 1860, met in their own convention in Birmingham, Alabama, with Confederate flags brashly in evidence. Amid scenes of heated defiance, these Dixiecrats nominated Governor J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina on a states' rights party ticket. To add to the confusion within Democratic ranks, former Vice President Henry A. Wallace threw his hat into the ring. Having parted company with the administration over its get tough with Russia policy, he was nominated by the New Progressive Party, a bizarre collection of disgruntled former New Dealers, starry-eyed pacifists, well-meaning liberals, and communist fronters. Wallace, a vigorous, though perhaps unrealistic liberal, assailed Uncle Sam's dollar imperialism from the stump. Considered by some the Pied Piper of the Politburo, he took a Soviet-friendly line that earned him drenched with rotten eggs in hostile cities. But to his supporters, Wallace raised the only hopeful voice in the deepening gloom of the Cold War. With the Democrats ruptured 3 ways in the Republican congressional victory of 1946, just past Dewey's victory seemed assured. Cold, smug, and overconfident, he confined himself to dispensing soothing syrup trivialities like "our future lies before us." The seemingly doomed Truman, with little money and few active supporters, had to rely on his gut-fighter instincts and folksy personality. Traveling the country by train to deliver some 300 give-em-hell speeches, he lashed out at the Taft-Hartley slave labor law and the do-nothing Republican Congress, while whipping up support for his program of civil rights, improved labor benefits, and health insurance. On election night, the Chicago Tribune ran off on an early edition with the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," but in the morning, it turned out that President Dewey had embarrassingly snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Truman had swept to a stunning triumph, to complete bewilderment of politicians, pollsters, prophets, and pundits. Even though Thurmond took away 39 electoral votes in the Deep South, Truman won 303 electoral votes, primarily from the South, Midwest, and West, besting Dewey's largely eastern-based 189 total. To make the victory sweeter, the Democrats regained control of Congress as well, thanks especially to support from the Republican-wary farmers, workers, and African Americans. Smiling and self-assured, Truman sounded a clarion note in the 4th point of his inaugural address, known thereafter as Point 4. The plan was to lend U.S. money and technical aid to underdeveloped lands to help them help themselves. Truman wanted to spend millions to keep underprivileged peoples from becoming communists rather than spend billions to shoot them after they had become communists. This far-seeing program was officially launched in 1950, and it brought badly needed assistance to impoverished countries, notably in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Excuse me. At home, Truman outlined a sweeping Fair Deal program in his 1949 message to Congress. It called for improved housing, full employment, national health insurance, a higher minimum wage, better farm price supports, new TVAs, and an extension of Social Security. But most of the Fair Deal fell victim to the congressional opposition from Republicans and Southern Democrats. The only major successes came in raising the minimum wage, providing for public housing in the Housing Act of 1949, and extending old age insurance to many more beneficiaries through the Social Security Act of 1950. Short-term legislative obstacles to reform, however, paled against seismic shifts in the domestic economy that brought substantial improvements to many Americans' lives. The long economic boom, 1950 to 70. Gross national product began to climb haltingly in 1948. Then, beginning about 1950, the American economy surged onto a dazzling path of sustained growth that was to last virtually uninterrupted for 2 decades. America's economic performance became the envy of the world. National income nearly doubled in the 1950s and almost doubled again in the 60s, shooting through the $1 trillion mark in 1973. Americans, some 6% of the world's people, were enjoying about 40% of the planet's wealth. Nothing loomed larger in the history of the post-World War II era than this fantastic eruption of affluence. It did not enrich all Americans, and it did not touch all people evenly, but it transformed the lives of a majority of the citizens and molded the agenda of politics and society for at least 2 generations. Prosperity underwrote social mobility. It paved the way for the eventual success of the civil rights movement. It funded vast new welfare programs like Medicare, and it gave Americans the confidence to exercise unprecedented international leadership in the Cold War era. As the gusher of post-war prosperity poured forth in its riches, Americans drank deeply from the gilded goblet. Millions of depression-print souls sought to make up for the sufferings of the 1930s. They determined to get theirs while the getting was good. A people who had once considered a chicken in every pot the standard of comfort and security now hungered for 2 cars in every garage, swimming pools in their backyards, vacation homes, and gas-guzzling recreational vehicles. The size of the middle class, defined as households earning between $3,000 and $10,000 a year, doubled from pre-Great Depression days and included 60% of the American people by the mid-1950s. By the end of that decade, the vast majority of American families owned their own cars and washing machines, and nearly 90% owned a television set, a gadget invented in the 1920s but virtually unknown until the late 40s. In another revolution of sweeping consequences, almost 60% of American families owned their own homes by 1960, compared with less than 40% in the 1920s. Ouch. Of all the beneficiaries of post-war prosperity, none reaped greater rewards than women. More than ever, urban offices and shops provided a bonanza of employment for female workers. The great majority of new jobs created in the post-war era went to women, as the service sector of the economy dramatically outgrew the old industrial and manufacturing sectors. Women accounted for a quarter of the American workforce at the end of World War II, and nearly half the labor pool 5 decades later. Yet, even as women continued their march into the workplace in the 1940s and 50s, popular culture glorified the traditional feminine roles of homemaker and mother. The clash between prescriptive demands of suburban housewifery and the realities of employment eventually sparked a feminist revolt in the 1960s. The roots of post-war prosperity. Only a little bit more left, I think. What propelled this unprecedented economic explosion? The Second World War itself provided a powerful stimulus. While other countries had been ravaged by years of fighting, the United States had used the war crisis to fire up its smokeless factories and rebuild its depression-plagued economy. Invigorated by battle, America had almost effortlessly come to dominate the ruined global landscape of the post-war period. Ominously, much of the glittering prosperity of the 50s and 60s rested on the underpinnings of the colossal military budgets, leading some critics to speak of a permanent war economy. The economic upturn of 1950 was fueled by massive appropriations for the Korean War, and defense spending accounted for some 10% of the GNP throughout the ensuing decade. Pentagon dollars primed the pumps of the high-technology industries such as aerospace, plastics, and electronics, areas in which the United States ran supreme over all foreign competitors. The Cold War military budget also financed much scientific research and development, R&D, hence the name of one of the most famous think tanks, the RAND Corporation. More than ever before, unlocking the secrets of nature was the key to unleashing economic growth. Cheap energy also fed the economic boom. American and European companies controlled the flow of abundant petroleum from the sandy expanses of the Middle East and kept prices low. Americans doubled their consumption of inexpensive and seemingly inexhaustible oil in the quarter century after the war. Anticipating a limitless future of low-cost fuels, they flung out endless ribbons of highways, installed air conditioning in their homes, and engineered a 6-fold increase in the country's electricity generating capacity between 1945 and 70. Spidery grids of electrical cables carried the pent-up power of oil, gas, coal, and falling water to activate the tools of workers on the factory floor. With the forces of nature increasingly harnessed in their hands, workers chalked up spectacular gains in productivity. In the 2 decades after the outbreak of the Korean War, productivity increased at an average rate of more than 3% per year. Gains in productivity were also enhanced by the rising educational level of the workforce. By 1970, nearly 90% of all of the school-age population was enrolled in educational institutions, a dramatic contrast with the opening years of the century, when only half of this age group had attended school. Better educated and better equipped, American workers in 1970 could produce nearly twice as much in an hour's labor as they had in 1950. Productivity was the key to prosperity. Rising productivity in the 1950s and 60s virtually doubled the average American standard of living in the post-war quarter century. When the link between productivity gains and income growth began to rupture in the 1970s, it signaled the beginning of the end of the post-war golden age. Also contributing to the vigor of the post-war economy were some momentous changes in the nation's basic economic structure. Conspicuous was the accelerating shift of the workforce out of agriculture, which achieved productivity gains virtually unmatched by any other economic sector. The family farm nearly became an antique artifact as consolidation produced giant agribusiness able to employ costly machinery. Thanks largely to mechanization and to rich new fertilizers, as well as to government subsidies and price supports, one farm worker by the century's end could produce food for over 50 people, compared with about 15 people in the 1940s. Farmers whose forebears had busted sod with oxen or horses now plowed their fields in air-conditioned tractor cabs, listening on their stereophonic radios to weather forecasts or to the latest Chicago commodities market quotations. Once the mighty backbone of the agricultural republic and still some 15% of the labor force at the end of World War II, farmers made up a slim 2% of working Americans by the turn of the 21st century, yet they fed much of the world. The smiling Sun Belt. The convulsive economic changes of the post-1945 period shook and shifted the American people, amplifying the population redistribution set in motion by World War II. As immigrants and westward trekking pioneers, Americans had always been a people on the move, but they were astonishingly footloose in the post-war years. For some 3 decades after 1945, an average of 30 million people changed residences every year. Families especially felt the strain as distance divided parents from children and brothers and sisters from one another. One sign of this sort of stress was the phenomenal popularity of advice books on child rearing, especially Dr. Benjamin Spock's The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. First published in 1945, it instructed millions of parents during the ensuing decades in the kind of homely wisdom that was once transmitted naturally from grandparent to parent. In fluid post-war neighborhoods, friendships were also hard to sustain. Mobility could exact a high human cost in loneliness and isolation. Especially striking was the growth of the Sun Belt, a 15-state area stretching in a smiling crescent from Virginia through Florida and Texas to Arizona and California. This region increased its population at a rate nearly double that of the old industrial zones of the Northeast, the Frost Belt. In the 1950s, California alone accounted for 1/5 of the entire nation's population growth, and by 1963 had outdistanced New York as the most populous state, a position it still holds in the early decades of the 21st century. With more than 38 million people, or more than 1 out of every 8 Americans, the Sun Belt... With more than 38 million people, or more than 1 out of every 8 Americans. The Sun Belt was a new frontier for Americans after World War II. Modern pioneers came in search of jobs, a better climate, and lower taxes. Jobs they found in abundance, especially in the California electronics industry, in the aerospace complexes in Florida and Texas, and in the huge military installations that powerful Southern congressional representatives secured for their districts. Niagara federal dollars accounted for much of the Sun Belt's prosperity, though, ironically, Southern and Western politicians led the cry against government spending. By the early 21st century, states in the South and West were annually receiving some $444 billion more in federal funds than those in the Northeast and Midwest. A new economic war between the states seemed to be shaping up. Northeasterners and their allies from the hard-hit heavy industry region of Ohio Valley, the Rust Belt, tried to rally political support with the sarcastic slogan, "The North shall rise again." These dramatic shifts of population and wealth further broke the historic grip of the North on the nation's political life. Every elected occupant of the White House from 1964 to 2008 hails from the Sun Belt, and the region's congressional representation rose as its population grew. The rush to the suburbs. Only 2 more headings. In all regions, America's modern migrants, if they were white, fled from the cities to the burgeoning new suburbs in the initial post-war decades. While other industrial countries struggled to rebuild their war-ravaged cities, government policies in the United States encouraged movement away from the urban centers. Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and Veterans Administration, VA, home loans guarantees made it more economically attractive to own a home in the suburbs than to rent an apartment in the city. Tax deductions for interest payments on home mortgages provided additional financial incentive, and government built highways that sped commuters from suburban homes to city jobs further facilitated the mass migration. By 1960, 1 in every 4 Americans dwelt in suburbia, and a half-century later, more than half of the nation's population did. The construction industry boomed in the 1950s and 60s to satisfy this demand. Pioneered by innovators like the Levitt brothers, whose first Levitt town sprouted on New York's Long Island in the 1940s, builders revolutionized these techniques of home construction, erecting hundreds or even thousands of dwellings in a single project. Specialized crews working from standardized plans laid foundations, while others raised factory-assembled framing modules, put on roofs, strung wires, installed plumbing, and finished the walls in record time and with cost-cutting efficiency. Snooty critics wailed about the aesthetic monotony of the suburban tract developments, but eager home buyers nevertheless moved into them by the millions. White flight to the leafy green suburbs left the inner cities, especially those in the Northeast and Midwest, black, brown, and broke. Migrating blacks from the South built up the urban neighborhoods that were abandoned by the departing white middle class. Tax-paying businesses fled with their affluent customers from downtown shops to suburban shopping malls, another post-World War II invention. Government policies sometimes aggravated this spreading pattern of residential segregation. FHA administrators, citing the risk of making loans to blacks and other unharmonious racial or nationality groups, often refused them mortgages for private home purchases, thus limiting black mobility out of the inner cities and driving many minorities into public housing projects. Even public housing programs frequently followed a so-called neighborhood composition rule, which effectively built housing for blacks in neighborhoods that were already identified as predominantly black, thus solidifying racial separation. Government-supported residential discrimination not only worsened segregation, but also fed the long-term wealth gap between whites and blacks, since most Americans' wealth consists primarily of the value of their homes. Last one. The post-war baby boom. Alongside its economic boom, America experienced an equally dramatic baby boom, the huge leap in the birth rate in the decade and a half after 1945. Confident young men and women tied the nuptial knot in record numbers at war's end, and they began to immediately fill the nation's empty cradles. They thus touched off a demographic explosion that added to more than 50 million bawling babies to the nation's population by the end of the 1950s. The soaring birth rate finally crested in 1957 and was followed by a deepening birth dearth. What's these fucking words? By 1973, fertility rates had dropped below the point necessary to maintain existing population figures without further immigration. This boom-or-bust cycle of births begot a bulging wave along the American population curve. As the oversized post-war generation grew to maturity, it was destined, like the fabled pig passing through Python, to strain and distort many aspects of American life. Elementary school enrollments, for example, swelled to nearly 34 million pupils in 1970. Then began a steady decline as the onward marching age group left in its wake closed schools and unemployed teachers. The maturing babies of the post-war boom sent economic shockwaves undulating through the decades. As tykes and toddlers in the 1940s and 1950s, they made up a lucrative market for manufacturers of canned food and other baby products. As teenagers in the 1960s, the same youngsters spent an estimated $20 billion a year for clothes and recorded rock music, and their sheer numbers laid the basis of the much ballyhooed youth culture of that tumultuous decade. In the 1970s, the most popular jeans makers began marketing pants with a fuller cut for those former kids who could no longer squeeze into their size 30 Levi's. In the 1980s, the horde of baby boomers bumped and jostled one another in the job market, struggling to get a foothold on the crowded ladder of social mobility. As the boomers entered middle age, a secondary boom of children peaked in the early 1990s, a faint demographic echo of the post-war population explosion. The impact of the huge post-war generation will continue to ripple through American society well into the 21st century, as members pass into retirement and place enormous strains on the Social Security and Medicare systems. Old people. Okay, that's it. Awesome. Jesus Christ, this is a long chapter. Both parts are 30 minutes. Okay, cool.